All right. Thanks, Scott, for joining me today. For those of you watching, we had a little disagreement about LDL cholesterol, saturated fat, and cardiovascular disease. But fortunately, Scott took me up on the offer to do this live chat. So I am thankful for that, Scott.
Thank you.
Now, before we get into, I know you want to share your story. I might say a couple words about myself. I
Yeah.
just want to lay out the kind of debate topic that we settled on here. And this is just copied right out of um, our email correspondence. So your position on the matter is that LDL alone isn't a causal risk factor for cardiovascular disease, or in other words, it requires certain contexts to be problematic, and that not only are saturated fats not harmful with regard to cardiovascular disease, but are healthful. As in, you had mentioned that if you cut saturated fat from your diet, that would actually be a harmful measure to take. Now, my position on both of those are that LDL, or if we're to get really specific, ApoB, which is the component of LDL, is a causal risk factor for cardiovascular disease, and that saturated fat does increase cardiovascular disease risk as it passes approximately 10% of total calories as the threshold to which we see risk. So that sounds good to you?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yep. Okay,
Yeah.
perfect. Now, just because I'm only going to share a couple of words, I know you want to do a more lengthy introduction, so I'm just going to just really quick.
Yeah.
So I've been plant-based for 10 and a half years. I focus a lot of time on nutrition research through social media posts. I was a scientific reviewer on the recent publication by Simon Hill for the recent book called "The Proof Is in the Plants." It's right up there, actually. And I'm a naturopathic doctor practicing here in Vancouver, BC. With that out of the way, I think that's all I really want to share. You can go on and share your intro. I'll mute myself for the time being.
All right, Matt, you're killing me. That was way too short. So I'm about to bore the shit out of everyone here with my introduction speech that I'll be reading from my notes. Part of the reason for that is because my memory absolutely sucks. And I still have cognitive issues from my health problems that I've had for years. So hope you guys could bear with me. However, I think it's important to tell my story and explain my position on some of the topics we'll be discussing today. First, I want to say that I am not a scientist or a doctor. I don't believe, Matthew, that you're a scientist. You're a doctor. That's correct?
I'm a naturopathic doctor. I just do a
Naturopathic
lot
doctor.
of, I just read a lot of, scientific literature and constantly integrate it into my practice.
Right. Okay. Okay. So you're much more of an academic than I am. Let's just leave it at that. But Matthew does have the clinical experience, which I respect. But I'm not the best guy to speak to if you want to have a serious debate on science, and I don't pretend to be an academic on science issues anyway. So if you want, I could provide some names for you who I'm sure will readily debate you, but I don't think it's appropriate to credibly be debating geeks like me off the street or chiropractors on cardiovascular health and nutrition science. In my opinion, it's an incredibly complex issue and takes years of study. So, no offense, but in my belief, it's just basically two guys kind of talking out of their asses, and that's just my opinion. But that being said, we could still have a go at it, and we do have your studies you provided that we could discuss and several points of contention that I think would make for a very good debate. And I hope that nothing I say is too offensive towards you or anyone else for that matter. I have nothing against veganism. I love vegans, and that's fine, but we do have some major disagreements on the subject. So it's likely to get a little bit heated, as these things often do. But really, it's all in good fun. And I think Matthew could agree to that. Luckily for myself, I sound a lot like Eeyore, and my voice doesn't get too emotional, so I might have the upper hand on Matt on that one. And yes, that was my attempt at humor. So who am I then? Well, I'm just your average guy that's been pretty sick for quite a good deal of time, which led me to all of my research and this crazy diet that I'm on. I've had terrible pain conditions for pretty much my whole life, which I was put on psychotropic drugs and antibiotics for years. which completely destroyed my gut. And I've had to deal with extreme forms of psychotropic drug withdrawal, candida, SIBO, and leaky gut, which on top of everything else left me in a mostly debilitated state for the greater part of 5 years, in which I'm still dealing with to this day. But now that I'm doing this diet and some other factors, I am able to function again somewhat. I went to many doctors and naturopaths, and again, no offense, but like most other people I've talked to, and with all the treatments they put me on, pretty much everything made me worse over time. So kind of out of desperation, I turned to this crazy keto carnivore diet. More specifically, the lion diet, which I believe was a term coined by Michaela Peterson, which is pretty much just a diet that consists of red meat based on ruminant animals, including muscle meat and organs. And it wasn't very long before I was on that diet before all my symptoms started to get better over time. It wasn't until later I learned about anti-nutrients and plant foods like oxalates and lectins, which could potentially wreak havoc and inflammation on your body, especially when you have leaky gut, where the plant toxins are readily absorbed through your intestinal wall. Not to mention candida and bacterial overgrowth feed off of carbs and fermentable carbohydrates found in plant foods as well. So I did not react well to them. Not that I have anything against eating plant foods in general, but for someone in my condition, they did not work well for me. When I was on a vegan keto diet, I literally was peeing out kidney stones and had oxalate crystals coming out of my skin on a daily basis, and I had oxalate dumping when I got off of that. Or I'd eat some peas and I'd look like I was 30 weeks pregnant. It wasn't until I went on the keto carnivore diet that the candida overgrowth, which plagued me for several years, started to starve off and fade away, and all my symptoms started to get better. For years, I had severe brain fog, feeling like I was on an acid trip 24/7, terrible blurred vision. I couldn't see properly. I had acid reflux, insomnia, and fatigue, terrible anxiety, akathisia. I lost 60 pounds, and the list goes on. I felt pretty much like I was severely drunk for about 5 years. And it was an unbearable nightmare that never ended. Luckily, I could say now that I am a little bit better. And that most of my symptoms are better. So, just in case anyone needed to know, my bowel movements are also regular for the first time in many years. Yeah, and even a lot of my blood values are better. My CRP is super low, my PSA went down, my blood glucose is pretty much perfect, and my cholesterol numbers are better than ever as well. Interestingly, my triglycerides are, I believe, are lower than Matthew's. Not that that's anything really relevant on its own, but I'd also probably make a wager that my HDL numbers are maybe higher as well. And that's all based on a red meat diet and organs for several months with nothing else in my diet. So pretty much my entire diet is based on fat and a little bit of protein and no carbohydrates. I've seen this time and time again with lots of other very sick people with autoimmune and gut disease, which in my opinion is just kind of one and the same. We went on this diet out of necessity, not because we wanted to. For the most part, it's not ideologically driven, and I do emphasize for the most part. And I don't hold any loyalty towards a diet per se. It does have its problems, and it should be done very carefully. So just touch on a couple more points before I give the floor over to Matthew. There are many points of contention between us, and hopefully Matthew could forgive me if I'm misrepresenting any of your claims in any way, but you could clarify after as we discussed. But my take on your ideas in general is that evolutionarily and ancestrally, things have changed, that we've been wrong, that we have no intuition as a species, that since the beginning of time, we've been poisoning ourselves as hunter-gatherers by eating a meat-predominant diet, and possibly even harming ourselves or harming babies with high saturated fatty breast milk. Not that Matthew has ever claimed that. The Inuit communities and African tribes who are still mostly on meat-based diets are unhealthier despite evidence to the contrary. Matthew and some vegan pundits will have you believe that we should all become West Coast hipsters, no offense, that shop at Whole Foods and eat processed tofu, processed proteins, factory processed inflammatory seed oils are largely controlled by big pharma and big agriculture, and that we're supposed to take supplements like B12 and zinc because our plant-based diets aren't nutritionally sustainable long-term, and fortifying all of our foods because we're reducing the most nutrient-dense and nutritionally bioavailable foods on the planet. And that we should follow the food pyramid, which promotes more than 50% of your diets as carbs. So why is that? Well, all you have to do is follow the money, in my opinion. Because big pharma and big agriculture, which are very much happily married, have massive investments at stake. And the dairy and cattle industries, even with all of their own faults, are just a blip on the radar in comparison. All of which I do intend to point out later. Any real scientist will tell you that nutrition science isn't a real science. In fact, it's a running joke among scientists. It's impossible to control for most variables, including confounding foods and healthy user bias. All they can conclude are weak associations, not causality. That's why year after year, we see so many contradictory studies. One day fat is bad for you, the next day it isn't. We have many studies showing saturated fat in red meats aren't bad for you, and many that don't. In fact, we have many that show an inverse association. And of course, what's good for someone could be subject to opinion. Even the evidence hierarchy, which Matthew wholeheartedly believes in, is a matter of opinion. Many scientists and clinicians provide different models for the hierarchies of evidence, with some scientists making the case that mechanistic data provides better evidence, and then clinicians who believe that supposed outcome is the only real evidence that you really need. However, when it comes to nutrition science, outcomes are always confounded by the countless variables that can't be controlled for. And the evidence hierarchy is just a matter of opinion, depending on who you ask. And what's at the bottom of the evidence hierarchy? It's exactly that, opinion. Now, I provided Matthew with meta-analysis that included 21 studies showing that saturated fat doesn't increase cardiovascular risk. And it appears that Matt only chooses to accept the evidence that he's provided and claims to be causal. My only assumption to that is it's because of his ideology and long-standing dogma, and because he has more studies at his disposal. There is more, I will admit that, but it's because it's backed by corporate stooges that solely rely on their studies for their existence and profits. And for all their faults, that is not the case for the dairy and cattle industries. I don't think there's anyone who would or wouldn't eat McDonald's because a study comes out saying red meat is or isn't bad for you. Whereas the existence of statins and other drugs are completely reliant on the studies supporting them and pretty much nothing else. And the food guidelines, which promote high profit margin, processed genetically modified grains, and factory-made seed oils, are mostly in the same boat. They aren't real food. They are products that are edible, but they're making us sick and killing us long-term. And yet we have corporate stooges showing us studies that they're good for you. The fact that big farm and agriculture, which I'll get into that love nest later, also produce these drugs, it would make sense that they have a vested interest in you not being healthy. And yet we're supposed to believe that their studies are infallible, that they don't cherry pick their data and adjust statistics for their own benefit. The fact is that their livelihoods depend on it. And again, no offense to Matthew, but his livelihood is also intertwined with him being a vegan doctor and is relying on saturated fat and hence red meat being bad for you. And seeing as how he's also tied ethics into his diet from many different perspectives, it kind of kills any sort of objectivity on his part as well. And don't get me wrong, the dairy and cattle industries do fund their share of studies, and fair enough, I wouldn't trust them either. And they are definitely open to criticism. I definitely wouldn't trust a study coming from McDonald's, and I 100% admit that. But there are some independent research bodies out there that are more reliable, and their data seem to fly more in the face of the big corporate dogma that we've been used to since Ancel Keys. It's not there to harm. Okay. Oh, sorry. Back up a little bit. In fact, some scientists postulate that LDL is there to fix the problem, heal inflammation. It's not there to harm you, and that it depends on the particle size and oxidization, which some evidence now also shows is caused by carbohydrates, not fat. I could say from experience that your body's a lot more intelligent than we give it credit for, and has a lot of defense mechanisms built in to protect you, which sadly we are now trying to disrupt through pharmaceutical intervention. For instance, doctors will prescribe acid-blocking medications when the acid is there to keep different organisms like yeast and bacteria in check from becoming pathogenic overgrowth and causing leaky gut, which I strongly believe is the precursor to most diseases that plague us today. Yes, there may be some evidence that taking something like a proton pump inhibitor might have a slight decrease in risk for esophageal cancer, but they'll completely destroy your health in other ways. And it's my opinion that statins work much in the same way. In all the years I've been sick and researching my way to wellness, I could tell you with certainty that the more we get away from nature, the more crap and drugs that we consume, the fatter and sicker we get, which is exactly what serves. All right, guys, so we lost connection there somehow. So I'm just going to back up just a little bit on what I was saying there. So anyways, in all the years I've been sick and researching my way to wellness, I can tell you with certainty that the more we get away from nature, the more crap and drugs we consume, the fatter and sicker we get, which is exactly what serves corporate interests. The truth is LDL can go up for many reasons. And just to say that high LDL without context gives you heart disease, I believe to be pretty ridiculous. LDL is not bad. It's a crucial vessel for our well-being. Case in point, LDL increases when we are in a fasting state, also increases in the process of weight loss. So context matters quite a bit, actually. And in my opinion, the only evidence that these studies have provided us is that bacon cheeseburgers washed down with a few beers could give you heart disease. So just to wrap up here, Matthew, and I know my introduction has been very long-winded. My main points of disagreement with you from your debates, I'm just going to list out a few here. All of your statements regarding saturated fat and LDL are absolute statements that keep referring to causality, which I highly disagree with. And even the very evidence that you cite doesn't make such claims, except for maybe in one study. And relating to number one, I found that you can, I don't know what that was. You do have the tendency to present some strawman arguments, like some of your opponents have, in all fairness, and claim that denying saturated fat causes heart disease is like denying that smoking causes cancer or that jumping out of a plane will kill you. So I'd love for you to explain those comments. And based on your ideology, you also claim, or you have claimed in one of your videos, that you, or sort of infer that you have a bit of a higher standing of personal and professional ethics based on environmental and animal rights, which, I would also love to debate you on, but that's for another conversation. And last but not least, in your conversation with Dr. Michael Greger, you suggest toddlers and little kids should go on vegan diets, and that the majority of their calories should come from caloric dense foods like nuts, seeds, and dried fruit. And for anyone that's interested, Dr. Michael Greger is giving talks on how to age well. And now, I'm not saying that I am the picture of good health by any means, but I implore you to Google Dr. Michael Greger in 2021. He's 48 years old. I'm also in my 40s. And I think with that, I've said enough. So back to Matthew.
All right, so there's a bit to unpack there. Now, obviously, a lot of what was presented there was not actually entirely pertinent to the topic of discussion or the agreed upon debate topic, but I will touch on a lot of these points. So the first thing you mentioned was that I shouldn't be debating random people, whoever. Reset. I have a whole list of on my Instagram misinformation 1, 2, 3. I think I've got 4 now. Maybe just the 3. highlights where I go through my interactions with various people online, some very well regarded, PhDs. I've got a professional sports nutritionist, all sorts of individuals on there. And I've offered to every single one of them to discuss with them this way. It is not my choosing who I end up actually discussing these things with. It is whether or not they agree to it, and they just never do. So that there's not much I can do about that. Now, you mentioned, look, as far as your own story, I do want to acknowledge that, like, I'm glad you feel better. Like, I truly am. I don't want anyone to, feel like they're struggling as far as, that's why I do what I do, right? I want to help people as well. Just feel better, feel their best, but also at the same time, without increasing the risk of long-term issues like cardiovascular disease and whatnot. Now you mentioned anti-nutrients and that a bit. Again, I think that we talked about in the email, that's kind of a discussion point for another time. I'm more than happy to touch on that in a part 2. And you have said that time is a bit of an issue tonight as well, so I don't want to get too far down that rabbit hole. And then you mentioned points of contention. Okay. So you said that my position on evolution is that evolutionarily we have been wrong, right? That's what you said that my position was?
I'm not saying that that's exactly what your position is, but it seems to be your position based on your comments.
No, so my position on that is that for evolution and for survival in times of, say, food scarcity and that, our goal for propagating our species is not to live into old age. It's to live to reproductive age. And so nowadays our goals are different. My goal is to live a very long, healthy life, be athletic, all of that until I'm into the old age. So I just want to clarify that I'm not saying evolutionarily we were right or wrong. That's just a very weird statement to make. It's just that looking at our diets from way back when isn't really telling us much about longevity, living into the 90, 100, so on. As far as the Inuit, I mean, here in Canada, you look at the mortality rates, you look at the life expectancy, even after excluding infant mortality. Government of Canada has these numbers. They're very poor. We're looking at like 10 years less. So I'm not sure where that comes from. The claim that I want everyone to be West Coast hipsters, that was kind of a funny one. I don't consider myself at all one of those. So I don't know where that comes from. Inflammatory seed oils, you mentioned that. We'll get into that, I think, at some point during this discussion. So I'll leave that for now. You also mentioned that I think everyone should be taking B12 and zinc supplements. I don't know where I've recommended zinc supplements. I'm not sure where I've ever mentioned that. Yeah, I'm not really convinced that we need to. Maybe I did somewhere. I've done a lot of interviews, written a lot of stuff. Maybe at some point I suggested that, but I don't remember it here. B12 though, yeah. I would like if you have any comparisons of like dairy or meat funding for research compared to like sugar industry funded research, if you have that, saying that, or just processed food research, whatever. If you're going to say that dairy and cattle are small time, to put your words there. You also say that's impossible to control for confounders. I think we'll get into that. We'll get into that here. Now, you mentioned the inconsistency in research. Now, there are reasons for that. It has a lot to do with the methodology. So some research, because of the methodology they use, or because of the populations they're looking at, they don't really meet the criteria for which you would see an increase in risk. Now, I'm going to leave saturated fat for a little bit to get into that a little bit more once we get past the LDL picture, but I just want to show this for a second here, just to illustrate what I mean. Like, for example, when we look at saturated fat intake and coronary heart disease, when you actually have inclusion criteria of significant number of event rates, like 1% or more, 10 years of follow-up, elderly populations, crossing the threshold of 10% of calories, which is where we see risk, and I'm going to talk more about that in a little bit, it's incredibly consistent. The consistency is unbelievable there. And so there are reasons when you don't get consistency, it's because it's not meeting certain criteria. What else did we have to go over here? We can talk about evidence hierarchy and what your personal views on that are, I think, as we get into things. And you also said you provided me with a meta-analysis of 21 studies. I'm not sure which one that is. I have your whole list. Can you give me the title for that one? Or the author?
No, I don't recall.
Because
I can pull it up after.
Yeah, because I'm 100% sure that it's not in the emails you sent me.
No.
I have every single one.
I apologize.
Yeah, but if it is, I think I know which one it is anyway. I just want to confirm with you, and so if you can pull that up at some point when we're going through, I can explain if it is the one I'm thinking of, why it doesn't agree with what we've been talking about here, or what I've been talking about.
Okay.
Okay, and then you also said that I said high LDL without context gives you heart disease. That's a stretch. It's a bit of a straw man on what I'm saying. It's that increasing your LDL does increase your risk, that LDL is causal to atherosclerosis, but it doesn't mean you're going to get heart disease, just as if you smoke, it doesn't mean you're going to get lung cancer. You're just increasing your risk, and that is causally related to the outcome. Now, you said I make straw man arguments about smoking, and it wasn't jumping out of a plane, by the way. It was just as an example. And those aren't straw man arguments. It's someone, if someone's going to say that this is the criteria we need to show that X leads to Y, and I say, well, guess what? We don't have that criteria for this other intervention or this other outcome. Then if we need that, if that is absolutely required, then we can't say that smoking causes lung cancer, heart disease, whatever the outcome is, or that jumping off the cliff would cause, whatever outcome we're looking at. I'm simply applying their own logic to a scenario where I know we don't have that evidence, yet I know that, or in most cases, I should hope that they believe that outcome is correct, or that they agree with it. Now, that's just to go over your points here really quick, and so we can kind of get into some of the research I wanted to share.
Before you continue, can I just touch on just on the last point? I don't want to touch on anything else.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
I do apologize if I misrepresented some of your views. I do apologize for that. So with regards to the smoking comment, now I did find it a little bit strange that the carnivore guy that you had the debate with wouldn't admit to the fact that smoking causes cancer, or that jumping out of an airplane. I mean, it's a pretty simple answer. Anyone.
Yeah, exactly. That's why I went with those.
Not to offend him by any stretch, but to conflate, to sort of like have that as an analogy, I found that to be really overboard. I haven't seen any studies that you presented, or anyone else for that matter, that shows the type of association with lung cancer. Yes, we don't have any evidence to prove that smoking causes lung cancer. However, according to some studies, there's an 11,000% increased risk association with lung cancer. So you kind of have to be an idiot to deny that, right? Okay. However, most of the studies that I've seen, when it comes to saturated fat and red meat, shows an association of less than 20%. I know that one that you provided the other day, I believe, was 16%. When you look at absolute outcome statistic, it actually works out to about 1 in 5 incident cases per 1,000 person years of follow-up. So let me just reiterate that. So 1 in 5 incident cases per 1,000 person years of follow-up, which works out to less than 1% risk. And you're comparing that to an 11,000% risk, right? Okay. So there's quite a difference there. And, how many studies there are that show smoking doesn't cause cancer? There are no studies that show that. However, we do have tons of studies and scientists that show us that saturated fat and saturated fat and high LDL isn't a causal risk factor for heart disease.
Okay, so with smoking, and I understand that point. With smoking, do you also think smoking causes heart disease? I just want to clarify that as well. It tends to have big RRs, but
I think absolutely it could. I don't think that. I don't know about the
not to the same degree.
That.
Yeah, not to the same degree as lung cancer, but as far as relative risk would go. But
I'm sure there's some risk factor there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, and then what about light or moderate smoking? Like, let's say 5 cigarettes a day, something like
that. Yeah, I would say there's probably some risk factor there.
So the reason I bring this up, and I'll screen share here for a second again before I really get into my points.
Sure.
I just want to make sure. Okay. The reason I bring that up is because when we're looking at saturated, and actually, just so I am 100% clear, the stats that you were pulling there were from the Cooper, the Cochrane review, correct? For the saturated fat?
Yes, I believe so. I believe so. Okay. I don't remember all this. I have a terrible memory, so
I'm pretty certain.
I'll take your word for it.
Yeah, I'm pretty certain that's where you pulled it. So, a couple important things to note there. When we talk about smoking, what sort of contrast exposure are we usually talking about? Like, what are we comparing the lowest level of smoking to the highest level of smoking typically?
I have no idea.
Like, usually you're talking about somebody who's never smoked ever to somebody who is smoking a pack or more a day, right? Fair enough, right?
Yeah.
With saturated fat, there is no exposure group. You're always comparing some level of saturated fat consumption to some greater level of saturated fat consumption, and it isn't always a huge variance. So the contrast exposure isn't huge. Now, as I'm going to share my screen here, when we look at smoking, when we look at low cigarette consumption, so let's say 1 cigarette or up to 5 cigarettes, like these relative risks that we're seeing are pretty comparable to some of the saturated fat research that we see. And so when we're looking at heart disease risk and say cigarette consumption, we see that same sort of pattern. Now, if you were having people who just absolutely slamming in the saturated fat like nobody's business versus someone who's not having any, now I wouldn't necessarily expect it to be as detrimental as smoking a pack or more a day, but I would suspect to see greater increases in risk. And we do have actually some research from, there's one by Z, I believe his name, XE is the author's name, with a relative risk of like over 5, and that's because long follow-up, young age at admission to the study and so we can actually, by creating length of exposure, by having a good contrast exposure, you can increase or decrease the risk that we actually see. So I just wanted to clear up that point with regard to smoking. So if we were to accept that even lower moderate smoking increases risk of something like heart disease, well, it's not all that different than accepting that saturated fat does based on the values that we see.
Well, I don't know if it's appropriate to link cancer studies with cigarette smoking. That's kind of the same as the epidemiological studies that you're providing.
No, so let me clear up that too. So another issue with the stats that you presented with the saturated fat compared to smoking is the smoking data is epidemiology that you cited. That is long, it's very long follow-ups. We're talking about, depending on the study, 20, 30, 40 years that's not necessarily that long a follow-up, but that long for time smoking with, decades of follow-up in the research.
Right. But it is also a lot easier. It's a lot easier to tease out the compounding factors.
I'm not, sorry, remember we agreed on no.
I apologize.
So with the saturated fat, the Hooper analysis that you cited, that was based on randomized controlled trials. Randomized controlled trials don't last that long. As study length increases, so does absolute risk. So it's very actually dishonest, or maybe I wouldn't say dishonest, maybe that's a strong word, but it's actually just inaccurate, or it's not a good use of statistics to compare the risks you see in really long-term follow-ups to risks you might see in a few year, 5 year or so randomized controlled trial. because the absolute risks do increase over time as more events occur. So is that, do you understand that?
I agree with that part of it. Yeah.
Yeah. So do you agree that if you agree that lower moderate smoking increases cardiovascular or coronary heart disease risk, that it's actually relatively consistent with what we see from saturated fat and coronary heart disease, provided that saturated fat does increase risk to the degree that we just mentioned? And I'm going to go through that data in a bit here.
If you were to, yeah, I mean, I guess you're kind of making sense there, but I do not agree that saturated fat causes.
Okay, no, just
and that's
just
the main point of contention here. So
yeah, just for sake of argument, for sake of
argument, absolutely fine.
Okay, so you agree with, so that's good. We got that out of the way.
Yeah.
Now I'd like to just jump into my actual arguments around like LDL and everything, which is how we're going to start off here.
Go ahead.
You're all right with that? Okay. So, this is actually the first study I sent you. It's not necessarily a study, it's a review, it's a consensus paper from the European Atherosclerosis Society. And basically what they did was they looked at all of the research that we have on LDL lowering, various levels of LDL, genetically determined levels of LDL, and risk of atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. And I just want to quickly go through the criteria by which they determine that LDL is caused in atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. So and I want to note that for each of these points, the evidence grade that they gave was 1, so like very strong evidence. Now, plausibility, LDL and ApoB containing lipoproteins are directly implicated in the initiation and progression, and this has been determined experimentally in basically all, or actually every mammalian species. As far as the strength, we do see that especially lifelong elevated levels in determined by genetics, for example, lead to markedly higher lifetime risk. As far as biological gradient, there's a dose-dependent log linear association that we see. So it's very consistent, and this is, again, we can go back to genetic studies, people with genetically varying levels and their risk, over their lifetime. There's a temporal sequence. So again, we see Mendelian or genetically altered levels lead to greater risk or greater decrease in risk compared to if levels are altered later in life by, say, medication, right? Because it's going to have less time to enact its benefit or risk. As far as specificity, now the Mendelian randomization studies and randomized control interventions provide unconfounded randomized evidence of LDL. And like that's seen with basically any measure or any type of LDL lowering. The consistency of association, over 200 studies involving more than 2 million participants with over 20 million person years of follow-up and more than 150,000 cardiovascular events. Again, dose-dependent log linear association with all of that. Now, coherence, this is just going back to everything I've just said, kind of summarized in one point, so I won't necessarily go off that again. And then reduction of risk with intervention. You take people, you randomize them to lipid lowering versus people on placebo, and you see a reduction in cardiac events. Now, in addition to this, there's one more study I'd like to share before we have you go on. Is that okay? You okay if I share my second one? Oh, did he lost him? Whoops. Let him rejoin. I'll just stop pausing, or I'll stop recording for a sec. All right, sorry for that hiccup for the viewers. Anyways, I'm going to move on to the second study regarding LDL that I just wanted to mention here. So I'll share my screen once more. Okay, so this was the second one I wanted to talk about. And this is really interesting because it's looking at people without classic risk factors for cardiovascular disease and actually looking at varying LDL cholesterol levels within the normal range, or the quote unquote normal range. And just a few really good points about this one, and I've got up here. So they had a cardiovascular risk factor free population, and then they had the cardiovascular risk factor optimal population. So I'm just scrolling down to the figure I want to touch on. So I'll be talking about this in a second. So the cardiovascular risk factor free population had untreated systolic blood pressure under 140, diastolic under 90, untreated fasting glucose under 126 milligrams per deciliter, untreated total cholesterol under 240 milligrams per deciliter, LDL cholesterol under 160, HDL cholesterol over 40, and no current smoking status. And then the optimal population had blood pressure, systolic blood pressure under 120, diastolic under 80, total cholesterol under 200, fasting blood glucose under 100, and A1C under 5.7. So this is what we would, overall call a healthy population. This isn't looking at LDL in the context of really high triglycerides and poor HDL and all of these other factors. Like, these are generally pretty healthy people. And what we see is that as we move from, and this is for the CVRF free, the cardiovascular risk factor free population, what we see is as we move from lower LDL cholesterol to higher, we have more cases of atherosclerosis, and as a general trend, more severity or more frequency as far as number of sites that have some atherosclerosis present. And this is pretty consistent with a lot of the other data that we have. And so while these people don't have or haven't had heart attacks yet, they do have atherosclerosis brewing, and eventually one of those plaques may rupture off and cause a clot, cause a heart attack, and that. So this is I think pretty solid evidence for having good overall cardiovascular risk profiles, but still seeing that trend towards increased risk as you move left to right. And then I should note that in the cardiovascular risk factor optimal population, only age, male sex, and LDL cholesterol were actually significantly associated with both disease presence and multi-territorial extent. So again, LDL cholesterol being a big player there. Now, if you have notes, I know you said you wanted to touch on the first two studies I mentioned. Would you like me to continue the screen share and you can point me out, or point me out where to go, or I can hand over screen sharing to you if you want.
Well, yeah, I'll share some of my studies in response to that. So first off, this might seem a little bit unrelated, but I wanted to touch on something that I brought up earlier. So I talked a little bit earlier about the marriage between agricultural and the pharmaceutical industry. And I'm sure some of you guys aren't too aware of this. So I'll just list a few here. We have the pharmaceutical company Bayer, who obviously is a massive pharmaceutical company and major statin player in these studies, who also owns Monsanto, which owns 23% of the global seed market. And funny enough, Pfizer merged with Monsanto's pharmaceutical business Pharmacia to become the world's largest pharmaceutical company. We have agriculture giant Syngenta, that was a joint venture spinoff of Novartis and AstraZeneca. And yeah, another big corporate agro company, Dow AgroSciences, was founded by drug company Eli Lilly. BASF, or BASF, I don't know how you pronounce it, forgive my ignorance, has a pharmaceutical wing that produces components to the pharmaceutical industry as well, and is a large producer of omega-3 oil supplements, funny enough, and the list goes on. Now, I know Matthew said before that you don't really find conflicts of interest to be that that much of a concern for most of these studies. And of course, I had to come with this study. But conflicts of interest is something that I look at first. And I hate to appeal to authority, but my dad was a research scientist, and he was a pretty prominent scientist in Canada. And he was the vice president of the Pharmaceutical Manufacturers Association of Canada, actually. And whenever he talked to me about researching studies, he'd always say, follow the money. And before you look at anything, look at the conflicts of interest. So Matt, if you could pull up that the first study from the Atherosclerosis Society, and just scroll down to that.
Yep.
And I'll let you respond after. I know you have a contention with this, that's fine.
Yep.
But I'll let you respond to that. So if you could pull up that study again.
Okay. One sec. Here it is, yep.
Yeah. So, sorry, it's a long study. There we go. All right, go back up a little bit. All right. So, if you could scroll down just a little bit more. There we go. Conflicts of interest. All right, keep scrolling. Keep scrolling, keep scrolling, keep scrolling, keep scrolling. Okay. So, pretty much every drug company you could imagine was included with this study. So that is something of note. I'll share my screen with you here.
Yep.
Okay. So on the Atherosclerosis Society, their website, this is their corporate partners page. It's all the massive drug companies, as you would expect. Pfizer, Amgen, BASF, of course, agricultural companies. Why would they be included with this? With the pharmaceutical companies, Novartis, Sanofi. So all the major statin players here and all the companies that are married to these agricultural corporations. And then I also want to show another one here. Sorry, I suck with technology. Let's see here. How do I bring this up?
You should just press share screen, and then it should be one of the options if you have it open.
Let's see here. No, that's not it.
Like, do you have it open in a tab? If it's open in a tab, you should be able to just press share.
It's open. It's open in a folder. Is there any way I could
open it? So open the folder, whether it's into like a PDF or however it opens. Just open it, and then you should be able to select it as what you're sharing.
Okay. So open the folder. Let's see. How could I get to my folder from here?
No. So you open it first. You open it first. You open whatever document or PDF or whatever it is you're trying to open it first.
Well, okay. Let me just go to the website for this because I can find it online. I have it on my computer, but this will just take 1 second. I apologize, folks.
Yeah.
But it is, I feel like it is worth mentioning. My internet didn't suck. It would make it much easier for me. Spray. So Matt, maybe you could edit this out.
I could try. I'm not that good.
Or not. That's totally fine.
I'm not that good at this stuff either.
Okay. See, let me see if I can find it here. So this might be it. Just loading up here, loading. Sorry, my laptop is like kind of from the 80s, so it takes a while for it to it takes a while for it to load up. Anyways, I could get back to that later. Basically my what I was going to share with you guys is that the president of the Atherosclerosis Society founded this review, has done tons of presentations for all the massive pharmaceutical and agriculture companies, and has gotten tons of grants for them. So there is a massive conflict of interest there. Apart from that, I want to get into some of the methodology with you, because I think really that's the important part of this. So if I could share something here. All right. So in the same journal that Matthew cited.
I read this. Yeah.
There was a response to it. Yeah, there was a response to it.
Yeah.
By an independent team that virtually cited no conflicts of interest. And basically, line by line, they kind of decimated this study that kind of came out from the statin and agriculture stooges. And basically showing that they completely cherry-picked their data. Our search for falsifications of the cholesterol hypothesis confirms that it is unable to satisfy any of the Bradford-Hill criteria for causality, and that the conclusions of the authors of the 3 reviews are based on misleading statistics, exclusion of unsuccessful trials, and by ignoring numerous contradictory observations. So basically what they did was they excluded a lot of the studies that didn't confirm what they wanted to show in their review. And they go through pretty much every point by point here. I'm not a scientist. You guys, if you guys want to take a look at this study online on Google, it's right there for you to view. But there were a lot of points here that I would find very hard to refute against. And I think it's clear from looking at the study that they did not include a lot of statistics and studies that disagreed with their view. Really, that's all I had to say about that. So if people want to look at the study, they could do it. I'm not going to go through the whole study. This will literally take me hours to go through point by point on all the things that they, in my view, explained and in my view, kind of completely destroyed all the evidence presented in that review. So I'll let Matt respond to that.
Yeah, so glad you brought that up. Very glad. But first, before we get to that, so you mentioned conflicts of interest. Yeah, in my view, and can you stop sharing your screen? Because I'm going to.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Just so you know. No worries, no worries. In my view, conflicts of interest may lend themselves to researchers possibly designing a methodology that will produce favorable results. I mean, that's certainly possible. What it means is that we have to take a deeper look at methodology. The conflicts of interest in and of themselves don't lead to falsified evidence. As far as I'm concerned, it's more so if it leads to poor methodology. Now, on that note, the very first reference you actually provided for me was the Journal of American College of Cardiology, Saturated Fats and Health, a reassessment of proposal of food-based recommendations, Jack state-of-the-art review. Why don't we take a gander at the conflicts of interest? Okay, so we have Danish Dairy Foundation, Area Foods AMBA, European Milk Foundation, dairy or some expert symposium on the dairy matrix, European Milk Foundation again, on and on. We can go through this whole list. It's nonstop, right? So did you vet your own research for conflicts of interest?
Yeah, and let me clarify. As I said before, I don't think nutrition science is a real science. So I think these my epidemiological studies are pretty much in the same boat as your epidemiological studies, and I believe that they're all kind of garbage, to be honest with you. So I just provided my garbage against your garbage.
Okay. So so my argument would be that there's quality and then there's lack of quality.
Right.
So
absolutely.
let's go through that the Ravenskov article, whatever, I can't remember pronounce the name, the article you just presented. We can go through point by point. They made so many mistakes throughout this paper that it's not even funny. And this was an article published by Matt Fedor on My Nutrition Science. And look, so they make claims that they cherry pick data, that they left out some important statistics. Well, if we look at the very first couple of references that they gave in that rebuttal paper you just mentioned, to support their position about select patients, Ravenskov et al. Cite 4 studies with supposedly a lack of association between LDL cholesterol and degree of atherosclerosis. The first study is a bare bones case report of 123 people who died in car crashes. The results are based on undisclosed biomarkers measured of randomly selected death cases that don't represent any particular group. Virtually no details given about serum cholesterol or prevalence of atherosclerosis in these subjects. The following citation leads to a similar problem, including a selection of around 200 case studies of individuals who died from accidental causes with no details of other risk factors provided. We can go through again the third study, yet another collection of case reports from 58 individuals aged 60 to 69 years old. Much like the previous studies discussed, measured serum cholesterol were again compared with the extent of atherosclerosis in varying arteries. The researchers did not adjust for any confounders nor consider temporality and cumulative exposure to total cholesterol, or more importantly, LDL-C. The fourth and final study, Ravnskov et al., shockingly, another case study of 43 individuals who died suddenly from various causes. It contains the same limitations as the previous three. After this, they go through a study of 304 asymptomatic women that supposedly demonstrate no association between LDL cholesterol and coronary artery calcification. Notably, this paper intended to observe coronary artery disease risk prediction capacity for the National Cholesterol Education Program, basically the guidelines. This was not looking at the relationship between LDL cholesterol and calcified plaque. And it still showed that under age 55 with positive EVT scans, which is calcified plaque for those watching, had significantly higher LDL cholesterol. We can go on and on. Ravnskov then mentioned one exception study, which is on a subcohort of actually one of the studies I mentioned. And so this was basically the one exception to the rule of the case studies and stuff they presented so far, which is hilarious given how well designed this was, how they looked at people without risk factors. We can go on the next section. So following false claim about the relationship with LDL cholesterol and cardiovascular disease. So it's more of the same, ignoring the temporality aspect. They mentioned American study of over 140,000 patients with acute MI with lower than normal LDL cholesterol at admission. I believe you sent me this one. Now, we might as well talk about that because you had sent a couple studies looking at LDL cholesterol levels in people who are hospitalized with MI, right, with heart attack, and suggesting that, oh, look, their levels are actually lower. Do you know what happens to LDL levels when you have a heart attack?
Goes down a little bit.
It goes down, and it continues to go down up to I think about 4 days or so. So it actually decreases. So admission values aren't a good measure of actually steady state levels. So that's another issue there. This is actually I think one of the exact studies you mentioned or you sent me. Mean LDL was 104. Oh, actually, yeah, we should talk about this study while we're at it too, because it's really funny. So 75% of the population did have heart attacks. Again, that leads to lower LDL. But we look at use of lipid lowering, about 21%. There's pretty high or pretty good correlation between diabetes and the drop in LDL. I'm just wondering, it's not on here. We can pull up the full study for that, but basically, diabetes, renal disease, prior history of lipid lowering, prior MI were all associated with lower LDL cholesterol. So, and diabetes actually drives LDL even lower upon MI. So that's again suggesting that just the people who had these heart attacks were not too healthy to begin with, and that their LDL was driven down because they had other comorbidities, or driven down more because they have other comorbidities. And like we can go through and there are so many times where in that review paper you link that they actually entirely misquote the studies they're referencing. Now, if you can point to those sorts of issues in the data I presented, I'm happy to look at it, but they just, as far as I'm aware, they haven't made any of those sorts of egregious errors.
Okay, if you could just, if you want to unshare, are you done?
Yeah, well, I mean, I could go through this whole thing, but just the point is that review paper made an egregious number of mistakes and used like case studies to try to debunk well-designed cohort studies.
Right. Okay, well, I would debate well-designed cohort studies, but
okay. But just based on like, would you agree that at least in that review that you cited the rebuttal that based on that little bit, which is the first about quarter or so that we skimmed through, it doesn't seem like they're presenting very good evidence at all.
Well, I don't know if I would agree with that because I'm not a scientist. So
Okay.
that might be your opinion. Again, I don't have the academic
Well, do you agree
research that you have. So
okay.
You very well might be right. I'm not completely.
Can I just ask a question?
Yeah.
My question would just be, would you agree, and I know you don't necessarily adhere to the hierarchy, but just would you agree that case studies that don't actually look at even biomarker measurements, or at least the biomarkers of interest, aren't equivalent to randomized controlled trials we have on lipid lowering, or again, we can talk about cohort studies. Like literally they cited case studies where they don't even give information on most of the biomarkers. And it's just like a bunch of kind of randoms.
Well, I don't know. I don't know exactly. I haven't read study by study or, everything in that. Again, I guess if you look at the evidence hierarchy, I guess you would say that meta-analyses are at the top of that. Is that right?
Yes, but one really important thing to note is that all else held equal, meta-analyses are at the top of that. Okay, does that make sense? So if you take, a meta-analysis, I always make this joke, you take a bunch of turds and put them together, you get a pile of crap, right? Provided that they're of equal quality, I would say yes, the meta-analyses are the top.
Okay. So, I mean, my contention with this article is that they lost the debate on this by saying that it proves causality. It doesn't. No scientist would say it proves causality. Even smoking, as you mentioned, which has an 11,000% increased risk, you cannot say that is causal. You can't say it. Just because they have a bunch of studies, and even if they're well controlled, whatever, the fact that they claim causality means that they've lost right from the get-go. There's no way you could take a bunch of epidemiological studies that are impossible to control for these confounding variables and say that it is causal. That is wrong.
Can I say something? So it wasn't. They had randomized controlled trials, plenty of them. They had Mendelian randomization trials. They had when I talked about the saturated fat meta, the Hooper paper that you cited earlier. Those are randomized controlled trials. So it's a straw man to say that I'm presenting epidemiology.
So you're saying that they took into account all the variables that go along.
Well, no, I'm saying that they presented, like in that review paper, there are numerous randomized controlled trials, plenty, very large randomized controlled trials with very long follow-ups. In the Hooper Cochrane review on saturated fat that I cited earlier, those were randomized controlled trials. That was not epidemiology that we're talking about. So if you're trying to argue, if you're trying to argue that the evidence I presented does not infer causality simply because it's epi, that is just false. That's not what I'm presenting. I'm presenting some epi, sure, but I'm also presenting randomized controlled trial data.
Right, but you're saying that that's causal. That is evidence of causality.
So you're saying randomized controlled trials don't tell us anything about causality either?
Not causality, no.
Okay, so we can't ever infer causality from anything, even if we have.
No, not when it comes to nutrition science. You absolutely can't.
So even in randomized controlled trial setting.
Never. Nutrition science, never. I'll tell you why. So let me explain it. So
sure.
A scientist would tell you this, okay? And I hate to, I love Bart Kay, but I know some vegans hate him, but he's a real scientist, right? And he's dealt with cardiovascular health, and he's written papers on it, and also he's a nutrition scientist. The only way that you could maybe prove causality in a nutrition science study is if you take two identical twins with the same genetic makeup, you put them into a lab and feed them the same shit with all other variables being tightly controlled. For you to cite surveys and
Again, randomized
all
trial.
these millions of variables, there are so many variables that there's absolutely no way that you could control in that setting. There is absolutely no way. And to say that that is causal is 100% wrong. Now you could say, now you can infer that something is a no-brainer based on the association. However, you have not provided anything that shows anywhere near, as you mentioned, the association with lung cancer and smoking as you have with LDL and saturated fat and red meat. So no, I would say that there is no criteria that would say that you could be anywhere near causal with your statements.
Okay, so for starters, we already talked about light smoking, and I think you agreed to that, right? Light smoking.
Yeah.
Right? So that association is nowhere near the heavy smoking and lung cancer, not even close. Like I said, it's RRs under 2 typically, and you already agreed that that's harmful. So your argument for RRs falls flat right there.
Sorry, I don't understand what I agreed to.
So you agreed earlier that light smoking still increases risk. Causally, I can't recall if you use that term or not, but for smoking and coronary heart disease, correct?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. And the relative risk for that was like 1.43 to 1.72, somewhere in that range. And you already agreed to that. Yeah. So if you require a relative risk of, let's say, whatever crazy numbers you want to throw out there, well, then you would have to say that light smoking doesn't cause that disease.
So you're basing this on your studies. I mean, there's many studies that show an inverse relationship.
No, I'm not.
But you're saying, so I haven't seen anything that in terms of LDL proving causality.
That's separate. That's separate to what I'm discussing right now. Okay. So what I'm asking you is, do you agree that light smoking, 1 to 5 cigarettes a day, is causally associated with coronary heart disease?
Yes, I do.
Okay, and the relative risk for that
but I can't say causal, okay? You could say that there's a very strong association, and yes, if you have half a brain, you could probably say yes. You would agree with that.
And why would you say that?
You can't use the word causal though. That's my point.
Okay, so with smoking, we'll leave that aside because I don't think
it's not scientific to use an absolute statement like that. So most scientists would want to challenge these beliefs. They wouldn't make any absolute statements, especially when it comes to nutrition science.
I'm not talking about, this is separate. We're not talking about nutrition. So we'll leave the term causal aside for a second. So you would suggest that smoking then increases risk, even if it's light smoking?
Yes.
Okay. Now, if we have, one of the arguments then about smoking and the epi that you mentioned was high relative risk, why would you accept it for light smoking when the relative risk is much smaller?
Because the studies that you present on smoking, it's much easier to account for the variables with smokers than it is for just a diet in saturated fats. So there's millions of different variables when it comes to eating. It's a lot easier to place smokers in a group than it is for people to eat fats. What does that mean? Carbohydrates are going to be many health or user biases included with that. So it's actually much easier to tease out smoking than it is just have a high fat diet.
And do you have evidence that applies to light smokers?
I don't have evidence for everything.
Yeah, so I mean, that's the point.
It makes sense. It's just logic to me, but yes.
Yeah. So if you're light, occasional smoking, or trying to moderate, be moderate with your smoking, that could be associated with better trends in other lifestyle habits than certainly heavy smokers. Maybe not as much as complete abstainers, but at the same time, basically every study we have shows that smoking is associated with poor dietary habits. How is diet not confounding smoking?
I get it, but you're conflating smoking with nutrition science.
I am not.
That's not acceptable.
I'm not conflating the two. I am simply asking.
Well, we can't compare.
I'm not comparing the two. I have not compared the two. I'm simply, at least in this past little bit I've been trying to explain to you, I am not comparing the two. I'm simply asking why it is that it is acceptable to say that smoking increases risk if it's, say, light or moderate smoking, if your criteria that you mentioned earlier is this high relative risk?
Because I don't believe in the studies that you presented. I don't believe that that risk exists.
So wait, so you don't think
did exist? If that risk did
you're
exist,
missing the point again.
No. Listen. If the data that you presented, if I believed it, then I would say
smoking?
yes. No, on LDL.
I'm literally not talking about any of that right now. I am only talking about smoking. Okay, I'm going to try to break this down for you.
Yes,
really
I
clearly.
agree with you on the smoking part. I understand what you're saying.
No, but I want to clarify why you agree. So you said that, and this is the only comparison I'm going to make to nutrition. I'm not comparing the latter research to nutrition. Basically, you said that the reason, or at least one of the big reasons why we can be so certain about the smoking research is because of this high relative risk. At the same time, if we look at light smokers, they don't have that high relative risk. They have a, by your standards, it sounds like a modest relative risk increase, which is going to be a very small, or I wouldn't even say very small, but a relatively small absolute risk. Yet you still agree that light smoking increases risk, right? You still agree to that, even though the relative risk is low. So clearly your criteria isn't a high relative risk. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I understand what you mean.
So why do you accept it for the light smoking scenario? I'm not talking about LDL, not talking about research. I just want to know why you're accepting it for light smoking, but you won't accept it otherwise.
Because the high intake of cigarettes, when you are smoking a heavy amount of cigarettes, there is a massive association with it. And that's why I would expect light smoking to also have a risk factor like that. However, when you're looking at meat, you don't have a high risk factor. You have zero high risk factor that proves causality or shows any real inference showing that red meat or saturated fat causes cardiovascular disease. So it's pretty much comparing the high level of smoking with the low level of smoking. It's the high increased risk that's making me think that the low increased risk or the low intake of cigarettes would have some risk with that.
So you don't think there's any possibility that there's some dose response, some sort of threshold to which there's risk
with what?
Smoking. Yeah.
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Yeah. No, I just trying to clarify.
You might have got me there. I literally just didn't understand what you just said. Can you just repeat that again?
Yeah. So you're saying that there is, because at really high intakes, there's this very strong association, that you just expect there to be an association at low intakes and no safe level, so to speak, at all. Like there's no threshold to which you start to have a risk.
I mean, I can't speak to that. I don't know.
Well, no, what I'm trying to tease out is, like, if we're just going on intuition, I mean, we can make a lot of inferences based on intuition.
Yeah.
Right. That's what I'm trying to figure out, why exactly you, like, it just doesn't seem like you have any basis for actually agreeing to that other than, it would just intuitively would make sense.
Yeah, I would agree with that. To me, it just makes sense that if there's a massive increased risk and there's a huge association with cigarettes.
And we're talking about
even if you do light smoking, there would probably be an increased risk. But again, we don't have that when it comes to saturated fats. So I just don't. So, I'll leave it at that. I have really nothing else to say about that.
Okay. And now, again, without getting into nutrition, it seems like a lot of your arguments towards the LDL arguments that we presented, or that I presented, it seemed like you kind of went off on nutrition research again. None of that I wasn't talking about nutrition. I want to be very clear. With the LDL research I presented, that was specifically on LDL as an independent marker. So do you have good arguments for that, or is it simply just that Ravenskov article that, again, has all of these issues that are just quite frankly ridiculous? Like, one of your arguments to that was that when I pointed out, the fact that they're using case studies, this, that, your response was, oh, there's no good nutrition science. It wasn't nutrition science. it was on LDL cholesterol and atherosclerosis for cardiovascular disease. So I'm still waiting to hear an argument for that.
Okay, well, as I mentioned earlier, I mean, do you believe that, I know that you don't think there's much of an association there in terms of numbers, but do you believe in small density lipoproteins being more of a causal factor? Do you believe in the oxidation of cholesterol from carbohydrates as well, or?
So on the first point, small dense versus large buoyant, in multivariable analyses, so when you adjust for the other factors, they're both increased risk, but more importantly, we have Mendelian randomization suggesting that risk is consistent whether you're looking at large or small. And I sent you that study. It was the final one in the list that I sent you, the lipoprotein subfraction. And I can even just pull it up really quick just to show what I'm talking about. So independently note, now I do agree that healthy lifestyle behaviors seem to track with large buoyant LDL, and poor lifestyle behaviors seem to track with small dense LDL. But when you're looking at small or large LDL, that falls victim to the exact issues that you've been trying to point out. It's the fact of all this confounding. So when you actually conduct research that controls for this confounding, like Mendelian randomization, we see that this from large LDL all the way down to small LDL, it's just so incredibly consistent. Like that level of consistency is almost insane. And then when you adjust for ApoB, which is the component of, adjust for LDL cholesterol as a whole, actually, no, this was the wrong one. They were looking at HDL there, my bad. No, that was the right one. I thought they did LDL. They didn't. Sorry, my mistake. But for the looking at just individual markers, the LDL is incredibly consistent whether large or small.
Okay, so you don't believe that large buoyant lipoproteins are less of a risk factor than small density?
No, if there is a difference, it's pretty small, and I think that the large tends to track with healthier lifestyle behaviors that reduce risk via other means, whereas small dense tracks with worse, less healthy lifestyle behaviors, leading to higher risk. And then we can get like LDL particle numbers, what really matters, or actually more specifically ApoB is what really matters. And so we can again have a large LDL cholesterol, just skewing the risk a little bit in that sense, like when you're not adjusting for ApoB. This gets really technical. Basically, at the end of the day, what I'm trying to say is that, yeah, when we look at whether you're genetically predisposed to higher, lower, large, or small LDL, risk seems to be pretty similar across the board.
Right. Okay. So you don't believe that they cherry picked the data, and you think that they left the data out, that this review that I sent you, they left it out because it was just a lot of bogus studies. Is that right? Which point exactly can you? Well, you said that the review that I sent you, that in response to your review, based on the first article you sent, you said that they, or I guess you're insinuating that they left out the study from the review I sent you because all those studies that they presented were bogus. Is that
okay?
Correct?
Can you point out which study? Like which study are you saying that they left out that they should have?
Well, in the review, you can see they said that they left out a bunch of studies, so it wasn't just a study.
So they make that claim a lot, but so for starters, in the they talk about the figure, right? They talk about that graph where apparently they left out a bunch of studies, and that's actually not what happened. I will pull it up here in a second. This is long. I just got to get through it.
So before we continue, though, in the title, it does say causal, right? This is a causal.
Yep.
It reads the criteria for causal.
Yep.
So can we at least agree that that's just wrong? That they shouldn't be. So you think that there's no way that this study's infallible? That these guys who basically work for the pharmaceutical companies couldn't have cherry picked data? They couldn't have done anything. They couldn't have done anything to sort of adjust for statistics or anything that would prove the case for them. Seeing as how that they have that massive conflict of interest of all being statin pushers, you don't think that there's any way that they could have
No,
messed with that study?
because I've reviewed the literature and I don't see where that is the case. And as I mentioned in the response article you cited, they did exactly that as well. And I'm happy to go through what I was just talking about.
That's fine, but it doesn't. But that's besides the fact. Even if the review study I sent, I'm asking you: do you think that this study is infallible? You don't think there's any way that they could have screwed up with methodology or cherry-picked data or sort of mess with variables after the fact with unadjusted statistics? You think everything is perfect in your study?
Yeah, at this point, no, I don't. At this point, I see no evidence of that happening. I see no reason to believe that that is happening. I've gone through a lot of the individual studies myself. I know this review I just mentioned by my friend there, Matt Medor. He's gone through every single reference given.
See, there's only so many points that I could make. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but there's only so many points I could make because I'm not a scientist. I can't review all this literature and say, this makes sense to me, this makes sense to me, right? All I could do is sort of look at the holes in your study and say, well, what were they trying to get at here, right? Because every study is started by trying to prove something. And obviously they have something at stake here and they have a lot riding on this being causal for them. So, I provided you with many studies, including a large number of meta-analyses, which is at the top of the hierarchy of evidence. And I don't think that you could just sort of dismiss all of that and say it's all a bunch of garbage.
No,
we can say that this is causal. I just don't see how that makes sense to me.
So for starters, you didn't actually send me a bunch of meta-analyses. You sent me the Jack review. You sent me a bunch of studies looking at like triglyceride ratio. You sent like one meta-analysis on LDL actually.
Okay, but that includes 21 studies with a participant.
No, you didn't send that. That wasn't in the email.
Okay, I apologize, but there is one that has like what 300,000 participants.
What's the title? What's the title and the lead author? Just so I know.
I don't know. I'd have to look.
Yeah, if you can pull it up. But just in the meantime, I want to go over this because you're saying that they cherry pick left out studies. So
I'm not saying that they do. I'm just saying that there has to be. You are saying that there's no way that this study's infallible, and I think that that's a bit of a ridiculous claim to make.
Look. I'm saying that based on everything we know about the association between LDL and cardiovascular, based on all the evidence they presented here, based on all the evidence that's been released since then, the consistency is almost absurd as far as the dose response goes. So there's no reason to believe that there's any kind of issue there. But I do want to mention one thing because I just assumed that you were getting that idea that they were cherry picking from that rebuttal article you sent. So even more astounding, Ravenscoff et al. Say that figure 5A in the Ference et al. Paper, which shows the linear association only contains data from 12 of the 30 supposed trials. This is nothing but an unabashed lie. Figure 5A demonstrates a strong dose response association between LDL cholesterol and 5-year coronary heart disease rates found in a collection of 26 primary and secondary prevention trials as stated in the text. So what they did was that I think they mixed up the actual so here, the only reason over 30 trials are not concluded here is because this analysis didn't contain trials that were not specifically secondary or primary prevention. So they actually had a proper inclusion criteria for that. And the authors of that rebuttal paper just said that they were cherry picking when they weren't. They actually had a solid inclusion-exclusion criteria.
Okay. Well, I mean, that's just one of many studies that they presented. What are you looking at right now anyway? What is this?
This is a point by point, reference by reference review of that rebuttal that you linked earlier. The rebuttal to the European Atherosclerosis Society paper you linked earlier.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I don't think we have time to go through every single study.
I'm just pointing out.
If you disagree with a couple of them, that's fine, but they went through many studies there. So.
I would suggest anybody watching this, I'll put it in the description as well, just read this full article. It's literally mistake after mistake, dishonesty after dishonesty all the way through. And it's incredible.
But the big pharma and big agri corporate stooges, they're honest. They're looking out for your good health.
Hey, if you can point out methodological errors, please do. but thus far,
again, I can't debate science with you, man. I'm not on that level. I apologize, and maybe I look like an idiot saying that, but I didn't go in the study suggesting that. I'm sort of here to sort of point some holes in your statements, your absolute statements of causality. That's basically why I'm here.
Okay, and I just want to, if you can, did you find the title of that one, by the way?
No, it was actually the one that was presented. I think it was the one presented in the Carnivore interview that you did, and he provided.
Siri Torino.
I think maybe the one that I sent you was the 5 studies, correct? And I think you debunked 2 of them, but you sort of dismissed the other 3.
So sorry, what?
The one I can't remember what it was. The one with the Carnivore, LDL.
Oh, here I have it. So it is Siri Torino, 21 studies, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Okay, so let's just go through this really quick.
Yeah, you could go through it. I would have to again say that I wish you would discuss this with a scientist who's very aware of these articles and knows how to read these as well. I don't disagree. I don't disagree that you have a lot more knowledge in terms of academia, in terms of researching this. I will say, I don't mean to offend you, but you're not a scientist, and you're not a cardiologist. I'm not saying that. I'm not trying to appeal to authority when I say that.
Well, look, I know cardiologists,
but I think that you'd be better off. I think you'd be better off debating all the statistics that you're showing me right now with somebody else, because what you're saying, and I think what a lot of your listeners are hearing are stuff that we don't really understand, and I completely agree with that. I've presented you with tons of studies. There's a million other studies out there, and I think that to show causality is ridiculous. To make the claim that there is causality is a bit overstated and ridiculous.
Okay, well, we've kind of already touched on that, but I just want to point out for this study really quick, again, looking at authors, Ronald Krauss, funded by Dairy for a very long time, FYI, this is your study. So just quickly going through, look, as far as their dietary intake data, not validated, not validated, not validated, not validated, not validated. We can go on and on through that as well. But what's most important, and this does require going into the individual papers a bit more. They did not, as I mentioned earlier, with that initial meta-analysis I showed in the PDF. I can share it again here. These studies, a lot of them, for one, didn't cross the 10% of calories threshold, right? It's crossed 10% of calories where we see an increase in risk.
But where did you get this 10%? Why not 11%? Why not 9%? 10%?
I'll show you in a second.
You don't have to. We're running out of time. We can't go over everything. I want to go to the next study.
Yeah, so I just want to point this out really quick. The biggest issue with this study was they adjusted for serum cholesterol. Serum cholesterol. So our whole debate here is about whether or not LDL cholesterol increases risk. Now, serum cholesterol is a good proxy for LDL cholesterol. So if you're adjusting for serum cholesterol, how is this at all talking to the point of LDL increasing risk? It's not. If saturated fat increases risk by raising our LDL cholesterol, so if A leads to B and then B leads to C, so saturated fat leads to higher LDL leads to cardiovascular disease. But you adjust for B, you adjust for serum cholesterol, you're ruining that whole association. You're going to get rid of it. You're just not going to see it. And so that's what they're doing here. So in a debate where we're actually debating the association of LDL cholesterol, and you're citing research where they adjust for that very factor, it's not making your point at all. It's of course it's not going to find an association. If anything, it makes my point by showing, hey, when you adjust for that factor, there's no risk.
Yeah. But those are epidemiological studies, right?
Again, no, this is just I'm telling you that's the issue with this data that you presented yourself, and there's a conflict of interest with one of the authors. Do you agree to that?
I don't care about conflicts of interest that much. I'm saying that your studies are played with conflicts of interest. I don't care about these epidemiological studies. I think in nutrition,
the first one wasn't.
Even not nutrition science, I think these are complete garbage, to be honest with you. I think that they've been. Yeah.
My LDL paper wasn't epi. It had some epi in it, but it was a review paper of largely randomized trials, Mendelian randomization.
That's great. That's great.
Yeah, so it's not.
So,
You keep saying, oh, it's epi, it's epi. It's not.
So you're saying that high HDL or high LDL, okay, without context, maybe may present an increased risk of cardiovascular disease in all people.
Everything else held equal. So that's where the context comes in, is that everything else held equal.
Okay. What about in cases, like I mentioned before, what about in cases of fat, people who are fasting? What about in cases of people who are losing weight? There are scientists and cardiologists, there's tons of literature out there about people who lose weight where they have increased LDL counts. So then how would that be associated with cardiovascular risk?
Yeah, I will explain that here. So
sorry, I have to let you go pretty soon.
Okay, that's fine. I just want to, I know why it's there. 1 second. I will show you exactly why. Because it's not about acute, like what your levels are in that exact moment. What matters is the lifelong exposure to LDL. So let's see. This is a good picture to talk about it. Okay, I'll share my screen. Yeah, so here it is. So let's say over the course of your life, you have an LDL of 200 milligrams per deciliter. From birth onwards, you're going to see this sort of a trajectory with your risk. Now, it's cumulative exposure to LDL or LDL cholesterol that leads to risk. So if you have a higher concentration, you're going to hit that threshold a lot sooner. So if you have a constant 200 milligrams per deciliter, you're going to hit that threshold where you have very low risk, but your risk starts to rise even as early as say 20. But you're not going to get into substantial risks until you're up, 40s and beyond. Now, if you have an LDL cholesterol your whole life of 125 milligrams per deciliter, you're going to hit that threshold around 40 years of age, and it'll continue up from there. Your risk will continue to increase. By the time you're 80, you'll have about a 16, 17, somewhere like that % risk. If you have a lower LDL cholesterol, like 80 milligrams per deciliter, you hit that threshold around 65 or so, or 63, whatever that is. And by the time if you live to be 100, your risk is still pretty small. We'll say 5% or so. Okay. That is why. So if you're looking at these acute changes, during a fast, you're not doing that forever. Your LDL is not at that exposure level forever. Your arteries aren't being pummeled with that LDL your whole life. It's an acute change that's not going to, in the grand scheme of things, have a lot of impact. It's the cumulative exposure to LDL that matters. That's why we don't see that.
Right. And do you disagree with some scientists that say that LDL is actually a response and actually a healing factor, not causal?
To cardio, you think so? People saying that LDL cholesterol is something that heals like plaques.
It's there to perhaps heal the damage to reduce inflammation. It's not there causing damage. It's actually potentially there as a positive marker to help heal your body.
I absolutely disagree with that because of everything. Lowering, we already talked about lowering LDL in randomized controlled trial lowers risk. We again have the Mendelian randomization studies showing that higher levels versus lower levels lead to higher risk. Like I just don't know what else we really need there.
Okay. So I just want to get into that one other one that you discussed there.
Which one?
The second one that you presented.
Oh, the PISA study?
The Spanish one.
Okay, yeah. Do you want me to share it, or do you want
no, I'll share actually, if you don't mind on sharing. Yeah. Okay, so that's right. I really do have to let you go in a minute, but we could continue this. Let me see if I could just find it here. Sorry, let me am I sharing with the screen right now? I can't even tell.
No, you got to click the share screen.
Okay, let me try that, find that again. As a Ray. Oh, I must have closed it by accident. So I apologize. Okay. Well, so just to touch base on the second one that you provide there.
Do you want me to share it? I can share it if you're having problems.
Yeah, if you don't mind.
Okay.
Okay, let me just find my here. Okay. So again, can you scroll down to the conflicts?
They aren't listed. Oh, they must be on the actual.
They are at the bottom of it. Actually, I think
on the PDF.
I saw, it just shows like it just shows funding there. Yeah.
I didn't know they were in the PDF. In the PDF. No, not in the PDF. So it's got to be on the actual.
Okay.
Yeah, the one.
Well, I could just discuss a couple of them with you here.
Yeah.
So I was actually a little bit curious about this study as to who did this one. I didn't really understand it at first, not coming from like a scientific background, but and I was a little bit dumbfounded when I found out that a bank funded this study actually. So I guess before I continue, you obviously think that this is a pretty credible study, right? If you present it, so it's kind of a smoking gun. So if you think the study was well conducted, then you must believe that the researchers who conducted it are quite credible then as well, right?
I think they're good at their job.
Fair
Yeah.
assumption? Yeah.
I think they're pretty good at their job. Yeah.
So before I'll get back to that in a second, but I just want to say a couple things. So Santander Bank, who funded it, is the world's largest soybean, sugar, and coffee producer. Okay. The European Regional Fund, who also funded it, seems to mainly focus on wastewater projects. Santander Bank also seems to have a lot of invested in wastewater projects. Now, I'm not saying that's a big deal, but I did find that to be a little bit curious. And the research was headed up by a group called Carlos Santos III. And they and Bank Santander seem to have done some other studies together. And it's funny because Carlos Santos III seems to have a very strong interest in showing the supposed benefits of soy, which seemed a little bit strange to me as well. And a couple of years after the study that you presented, the study that you just cited, they were also on the research team of another study. And do you know what that study was by any chance? No. Okay. So let me see if I could have a look there and see if I could actually find it. Maybe I'll unshare the screen for a second. Oops, sorry. Just so I could find the study while I am searching for it. So question for you, because I suck at this. Actually, no, I think I got it here. Sorry, give me one second. It's kind of killing the climax of my argument here, but 1 second. How are things in Vancouver there? Having good weather?
I mean, it's warm. We had some fires further inland, so had a little bit of smoke yesterday, but otherwise, I think it's pretty good today.
Yeah. All right. Red meat. Okay. Oh, well, this sucks. I don't know what happened to it because I did have it open here. And this was a pretty important study.
Mhm.
I don't know why I'm having such a hard time finding it. Doo -doo -doo.
Just because you asked while you're looking that up, I might just share something here. You're asking about the 10% threshold, and that comes from, or at least is very well illustrated in the Cochrane review I sent you. Again, based on randomized controlled trials. And they found that for CVD events, CVD mortality, that risk increases from about 8% up to about 10%, and then it plateaus out. And so that's why you need to see exposures across that threshold, ideally from a few percent or a couple percent below to a couple percent above to get a decent contrast. And then you see risk basically every time, as long as you don't adjust for the serum cholesterol, like I mentioned, or the LDL cholesterol I mentioned before. I'm not really aware of any research that doesn't find that association when you have a decent contrast across that. Whereas if you're comparing, people eating 11% versus people eating like 14% or something, you're just not going to see any increase in risk because they've already peaked. So that's just why, just so you know. And again, randomized controlled data, not epi.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Sorry, I don't know why I'm having this, but this was kind of the smoking gun of my argument, and I kind of screwed up, and I don't know what happened to the study, and I'm having a very hard time finding it.
Title or anything?
Well, that would kind of ruin it. Just give me 1 second here. See if I can find it.
And which author was it?
Oh, here we go. I found it. Okay, here we go. Yeah. Let me share a screen. Just give me a sec.
Yeah, go ahead.
Just waiting for it to load up. All right. Okay. So let me share the screen. And why is it not? Here we go. Okay. So the same researchers a couple years later were part of this study. Regular consumption of either red meat or soy protein does not raise cardiovascular disease risk factors in men at heightened risk. So if the researchers, if that was such a great study that you presented, why are they part of this study 2 years later?
So how many of the researchers are crossover here?
There was one, Carlos Santos.
Okay, so yeah. So again, one thing to note too, and I'm not saying that, I mean, I'm sure he is a good researcher. I wouldn't say that, one researcher crossing over really means much, simply because there are, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 researchers on this paper I cited. Right. There's, they could all be involved to varying degrees. And of course, the research I presented was with regard to LDL cholesterol levels and atherosclerosis, not necessarily nutrition research. And what I typically see a lot of is when researchers cross over from other fields to nutrition, they make a lot of mistakes, like the adjusting for serum cholesterol I mentioned, like the not accounting for the threshold effect, all of those sorts of issues. Now, with this particular study, I didn't, I actually think I've read it before too, but I didn't go through it prior to this. I'm happy to go through it right now with you. But simply because the researchers of that previous paper did a good job with the topic of LDL cholesterol and atherosclerosis, that doesn't mean that they understand everything about like dose responses and comparators and all of that with regard to nutrition research. So I
Right,
wouldn't.
but
And
that's
plus,
kind of the crux, right? Because saturated fat raises LDL, so obviously
yeah,
they're aware of
fair
that. So I
yeah,
don't know
yeah,
why
but
they would present this.
yeah. No, but that's fair. But in this paper, I mean, what were the differences in saturated fat consumption? What was the dose that they gave? What were the comparator foods? All of those factors also matter, right? So we have to look at that, and I'm happy to go through it live with you right now if you'd like.
I don't think that there's much point in going through that. If you want to go through it on your own time, that's fine. But I just want to give this as sort of a
So
response
yeah,
to
so
the
so that
research
is
that was done on that study.
okay. So yeah, so I don't see how that at all discounts what I presented. But do you have any methodological errors with what I actually did?
I mean, I just in general, not with that study in particular, but basically all the studies that you present. Again, I don't think that you could have a well-controlled study, as you mentioned, when it comes to nutrition science.
It wasn't nutrition.
I think it's, well, even when it comes to your studies on LDL,
Really?
I think that there are way too many confounding variables, and there's no way that you could sort of like, take into account all of them. It's almost impossible to do so.
So let me just ask this. So if the researchers are blinded, the participants are blinded, one person or half get, and they're randomized, they have very similar baseline characteristics. You have no idea about, or no differences between their baseline characteristics. Some of them get a statin, they don't understand that they did, or they get other cholesterol lowering medications. They don't know whether they got that or placebo. The other group got the placebo, again, not knowing what they got. Where's the confounding there?
Where's the confounding? I would say that, well, you don't believe in the theory that that a large density lipoproteins is any different from small density lipoproteins. So I think that there's a lot of context there. Again, not being a scientist, I can't say for sure, but I'd say that not believing that, I think that's crucial to the argument. And and they don't take into account a lot of studies you've presented don't take that into account either. So
like for starters, there was a subsequent publication by the European Atherosclerosis Society that does touch on all of that as well.
Well, of course they touch on that because that proves their theory, right?
What? No, on talking small and large.
What's that?
I'm talking about on small and large and
and them saying that there's no difference.
Yeah, well,
you don't find that a least bit suspicious that is the same people who presented your review that made a publication saying that there's no difference between small density and large density lipoproteins.
The Mendelian randomization I cited was after that publication and by different researchers on small and large, and we also have multivariable analysis looking at small and large, both increased risk. So these are different research.
And there's some points that there's some studies that disagree with your points.
So. Yeah, and the ones that do disagree don't perform a multivariable analysis.
That's your opinion. I will have you.
No, that's not. That's literally fact. That's literally fact. When you conduct a proper multivariable analysis, adjusting for or controlling for all those other factors, you just simply don't see a change in risk. And so again, you have a group of people. You're lowering LDL, let's say non-specifically, so you're not targeting one type or the other, but just lowering LDL cholesterol. In a double-blind, placebo-controlled manner with very well-matched baseline characteristics, would you say that there is still confounding there? Because you haven't really answered that question.
Well, I believe some of the studies you suggested actually also have, they have unadjusted statistics, which
I'm talking
which
about
I believe the review that I say you, I believe they actually say that some of those statistics were adjusted after the study was done, which is not scientific in the slightest.
Controlled trials. I'm talking about the randomized controlled trials. Do you have any evidence of those? What reason do you have to believe that in a case you enroll a whole bunch of people, very well matched, or you split them in half, both groups very well matched, nobody knows what they're getting, the researchers don't know what they're getting, Half of them get a statin or other cholesterol-lowering medication. Half of them get a placebo. They don't know what they got. Where is the confounding?
Sorry, are you only saying this relating to statins?
No, any kind of, there are a variety of cholesterol-lowering meds, and just to illustrate that, I can show you.
No, but are you talking about, you're talking about cholesterol-lowering meds, but you're not talking about foods at all here or anything like that, right?
No, I'm talking strictly about things that just modify LDL cholesterol by medication. Variant types.
Well, I can't speak to that. I've never made the claim that statins don't work for everyone. I think that they harm a lot of people, and I think maybe in some cases they might help people. So,
well, I mean, a lot of the research you even sent me, actually, even though they found this, they might have found some odd associations between LDL, which I can explain as well. They actually found that statins were beneficial, like across the board. But that's not the point I'm trying to make here. What I'm suggesting, and I will show you this. I'm suggesting is that we're lowering, again, these are randomized controlled trials, lowering LDL by all of these various means. And there are 4 trials with diet right here, but we can talk about all of these ones that just have very minor impact.
But again, Matthew, sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but I cannot tell you that. First off, I'd have to really research the methodology. So I'm not necessarily criticizing the methodology. The main point of contention here was causality. Okay. Mm-hmm. They cannot prove causality. I don't care what you say.
In a randomized controlled
trial, there's absolutely no way. And even most of the studies you presented cite associations. Even they don't cite causality, except for that one. And that wasn't even a study. That was just them presenting other people's evidence. Yeah, and they didn't even say that they were causal.
So that's a misunderstanding. That's a misunderstanding of where the term like causality comes from, or causal comes from. It's not from an individual study. Nobody is going to conduct one. I mean, maybe for a I just want to clarify here why that there's that. You keep saying only that one paper did. There's a reason. When you're talking about randomized controlled trials, you can, in certain cases, if it's very well conducted, well powered, at least for the specific population that you're looking at. But with something like LDL, it's because an individual cohort or an individual study of various forms likely isn't going to be enough in and of itself. When the relationship is incredibly consistent, there's a dose response, as you see here, various LDL cholesterol lowering methods and a log linear association there. When you have that incredible consistency amongst randomized controlled trials, MRs, observational research, etc., all showing the same thing, that's when we can say that it is causal. That's where it comes from.
So for the second study, can you provide the unadjusted statistic outcome for that study? Can you calculate?
For which one? For which one?
For the second study, you sent me the Spanish bank one.
Why do you want that? You want to calculate like absolute or something?
Yeah, the absolute statistical outcome from that study. Can you calculate that?
I mean, we can, but why would you do that if I already know you're going to say that you don't, like, you already said you don't care about epi? Like, why does it matter?
No, but you do. So why don't you calculate the absolute statistical outcome from that study and show us that?
So actually,
if you're trying to prove causality, I could tell you this, okay?
Yeah.
So you could say that 1 in 10,000 people have cardiovascular disease risk from eating saturated fats, right? And you could have it maybe where 1 in 5,000 people who don't eat saturated fats have a risk factor for cardiovascular disease, right? And you could say that there's 100% risk association.
You've changed topics again. You're talking about saturated fat again. We're talking about LDL.
Right, but this is kind of what that study shows, though, isn't it?
Wait.
Right? Because if you calculate the unadjusted absolute statistical number for that,
why would you do unadjusted?
We'll see what the true number is then.
Why would you do unadjusted? Yeah, but why would you do that? Why would you not do an adjusted? Like, you've already talked about confounding issues. Why would you not want adjusted numbers?
Because they, as I mentioned before, and with the other study, is that they could adjust for those factors after the study is completed, which is not scientific at all.
For which, sorry, which study are you referring to now for the second one?
For any study.
No, I'm talking about randomized control. Like, literally,
For many of the studies that you cited in that first study, they did that actually. And I believe in this study as well, if I remember, I did read some of it over, but I think that they did adjust for a lot of things.
Sorry.
But
I'm not clear which one. I'm not clear which one you're talking about.
The review that I sent you before,
yeah.
The review that I sent you before lists how they did not, how they adjusted statistics after the study was already completed.
No, so those are all mistakes that are outlined in the rebuttal areas. And we can go, like I said,
that's fine, but you can't provide me with the absolute outcome statistic of this study.
Well, because it's not, so it's a bit of a painful one to try to calculate, simply because it's not looking at like it's not looking at an either or. It's not just two variables, right? It's looking at varying levels as you move up by 10 milligram per deciliter chunks with rates of atherosclerosis. Now, we do have, if we, 1 second, we can go here.
And sorry, I messed it up. I meant to double the risk factor. And the
previous
one. I get a little bit nervous. I get a little bit nervous. I jumble my speech, so you have to forgive me.
Okay, so here you go. So I think this is what you're asking for, but I don't think you're quite asking for it in the correct way. So if you look at this, the number of people in each category is here, and then you have the number within, atherosclerosis in varying numbers of sites of arteries or arterial segments. So we can see that number increases as we go. Now, if you want to do percentages, go ahead. You have the numbers right there, and you have the N right there. We can do that. But basically, certainly as a percentage, it is increasing substantially, and the absolute numbers are also increasing. We're going from 0 to up here 52, 54, 64, right? Right there. So like, I just don't know what exactly you're trying to look for here, because like I said, it's not like you're looking at a risk of either yes, someone had a heart attack, or no, they didn't, and then you can calculate an absolute risk from that. It's not exactly what like, that's why it's so confusing to me, because I don't know if you are wording that correctly.
I am wording correctly. I'm looking for the unadjusted outcome statistic from this study of the total number of people that where there was some kind of risk factor that led to cardiovascular disease
or LDL. So it's a continuous variable here. I don't think you're understanding. It's you're going up in 10 milligram per deciliter sections. It's not like you're looking at X LDL cholesterol value versus X, or versus Y value. We're looking at, like, unless you want me to calculate for each 10 milligram per deciliter chunk, that's going to take a while, but you can very clearly see it here. And these are all in people with their, as I mentioned, systolic blood pressure under 140, diastolic under 90, good fasting blood glucose, HDL over 40, and on and on and on.
Right. But so it just sort of calculates right as you're going, but there's no absolute outcome here, right?
Well, these are like, I recall, those are percentages. So if you want, like, look, if you want percent of people with an LDL of 150 to 160, here you go. I'll do that one for you. So LDL cholesterol of 150 to 160, we have 64 percent, 2.64 times 163 people. Okay. Oops, I messed that up. And then we have, 104 divided by 163. So 64% of the, we already knew that, but 104 out of the 163 with LDL between 150 and 160 had atherosclerosis. And if we go down, now mind you, the 50 to 60 is only an N of 2, so I would combine maybe the first 2 groups just to be more fair and increase that a little bit. There was 1 individual out of 11, so like 9%. So yeah, there was 1 out of 11 there. If we include the third group, which would be 41 people, we're looking at 52 individuals. I'd have to calculate that actually. Okay, so that would be 8.7. We'll say 9 people out of 52. And the first 3, I'm stretching it. I'm giving you, I'm like literally steel manning your argument as far as I can to give you even more range there. If I wanted to really just, even though it's a small sample, go with 0, I could pick the 50 to 60 milligram per deciliter range. So there's your number as far as what you're asking for. I think I'm still not 100% clear if that's what you're asking for, but I'm pretty sure it is.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I'd have to take your word for it, but that is relevant to the discussion.
Okay.
So again, I mean, we could continue this for another day. I hate to get going with you here. It's been interesting. I've been love talking to you. I'm sorry I suck at this kind of thing. It's the first time I've ever done this. But I guess just my main point here is that I don't really like the absolute terms that you use. I don't really like you saying that it's causal and lumping saturated fat in with that as well. There's a lot of things that we disagree on. I think that in terms of some of the claims you made with like ethics and stuff like that, I very much disagree with some of that as well. So maybe that's something that we could continue for another debate at some point. But
yeah, and as you probably figured out, I think this is why I wanted to nail down the topic, because I know you mentioned a whole bunch of stuff out the gate, but obviously it takes a while.
Right.
You didn't even get through most of stuff here, so that's why. So yeah, if we were to do a number 2 at some point, whether it's continuing this topic or another topic, we can figure that out. That's fine. It's cordial, like it. Hopefully,
exactly. No.
Issues.
Yeah, you seem like a good guy. The thing is, like, again, I'm not claiming, like, when I'm talking, like, if I'm sort of saying anything that is sort of out of my field of expertise, again, I'm not a scientist, I'm not an expert, I'm not a cardiovascular or a cardiologist or anything like that. I'm just a guy who's been sick and been researching this stuff, right? And I know that the diet that I'm on has really helped me and lots of other people. And it bothers me when you have a lot of people who are trying to, sort of negate that completely and, point to causality when I don't think it's really there. I know you do, but we still disagree on that. I'm not surprised. But I think that I would be better for debate, in terms of, again, the ethical stuff around it and the environmental stuff. When it comes to science, again, I just don't have the sort of intelligentsia to sort of go back and forth with you on that, in that field.
Well, and on that topic, though, if we were to get into environment, I think that would be
what, sorry?
A scientific debate if we touch on environment.
Yeah, and I think I could deal with that a little bit better. So I wouldn't mind doing a round 2 with that. And maybe, someone who's a little bit more knowledgeable in this stuff could pick up where I left off in some of my studies I presented, and you guys could go back and forth on that stuff. Because again, you could take your word for it, but I don't think, again, I'm a bit of a dumbass. I don't understand some of that stuff. And I'm sure your listeners don't understand some of that stuff. So to me, it comes across as opinion. And you sound like an educated guy. I'm not saying it's all a bunch of just blowing smoke out your ass, but I believe that you are wrong on some matters. So that's just my opinion as well.
And so just to close out for myself too, I think one of the biggest issues here was there seemed to be a lot of misrepresentation of, when I'm presenting randomized controlled trial data or randomization data and then either changing topics to, saturated that, or saying that I'm citing epi when I'm clearly not. And at the end of the day, when it came to the question about placebo-controlled trials, I just don't think he gave an answer. I don't think there was an answer there to where the confounding comes from. So I think that's another big issue. And as you said, not a scientist, that's fair enough. But yeah, I think it seems to me, and welcome to discuss this further later as well, that a lot of what you pulled were just articles that suited your bias, yet you hadn't actually evaluated them in depth. That's what I kind of take from it. You see a rebuttal article, oh, that looks like it craps on the EAS paper, therefore I'm going to cite it without really looking at the details. And when it comes to conflicts of interest, yep, they can certainly play a role in leading to poorly designed studies that provoke certain results. Absolutely, that can happen, but without actual methodological errors, I don't see how that is an issue. And if we're to point to conflicts of interest, we would have almost no research on anything really.
Right, but you're not a scientist, so you saying that there's no methodology. Sorry.
Oh, I know a lot of scientists. I know a lot of PhDs. Yeah, I know a lot of.
Well, I understand that, but you're not a scientist yourself, so that's your opinion that there's no errors in the methodology.
Well, no, if someone wants to point them out, they're happy to. I'm happy to hear.
Right, and no offense, but I mean, you're saying I have bias. I mean, you definitely have some bias as well.
Right? I'm not saying I don't. Just out the gate, I think one of the you mentioned multiple times my ideology. I think it's very clear that you also do. When I come to evaluating the research, I try to set that aside. Knowing your bias is number one. You have to know your bias, set it aside. I think I do so pretty well. I crap on vegans all the time. They make dumb claims that I don't like and that aren't supported by the evidence. I'll point out, look, these are the issues with that claim. We shouldn't be making that claim. It hurts our cause to make that claim, false claim, because it gives a lot of people, fodder to go after us for making false claims. So I absolutely target both audiences. I'm not one who's just going after the keto or the carnivore crew or whatever. No, I will point out issues with vegans. I actually recently had he didn't want it to be publicly on IG and stuff, so we did it privately, but we had a discussion about some stuff that somebody was saying in the vegan community who disagreed with me, saying that no, it's actually not a good argument for us as vegans to be making because it's not supported by the evidence, whereas he wanted to continue making the argument. So I don't see that my bias is playing all that big a role. And when it comes to the research, I am looking at it, and I just don't think you've really pointed out significant flaws in anything that I provided, other than again pointing to things like conflicts of interest.
Yeah, I disagree with that on a couple points. I think I did point out a couple flaws, maybe not completely in the methodology, but I think that a lot of the methodology is completely flawed to begin with. I don't think that you can control from, with most of the variables. And I'm not just talking in terms of nutrition science. I think there's a lot of other things as well. And I think that would greatly tie into a debate on saturated fats, because obviously saturated fats, can increase LDL-C, as you mentioned.
Yep.
So, and I don't believe that at all. So,
okay.
So maybe we could touch base on that at a future date.
But again, when it comes to that whole argument, I don't think you've provided an argument for why placebo-controlled trials with well-matched groups and randomization is going to cause any kind of confounding. I don't think you provided any kind of answer.
Yeah, no, I don't completely disagree with that. Again, I'm not really.
So again, the evidence I presented, while some of it might be FD in that what is determining causality when it comes to LDL cholesterol is not. It is based a lot more on the randomized controlled trial data, the Mendelian randomization data, and then the epi is just, oh look, it actually is shown in these long-term epi studies.
Right, but like I said, whether you disagree with them or not, there are studies out there showing that it's not causal. So I know that your bias kind of says that you disagree with basically every study that's thrown at you, and you say that there's problems with methodology, including the meta-analyses, which included many years of many subjects.
It used non-validated cues. It adjusted for serum cholesterol, which is the exact topic at hand. And they didn't always cross the 10% threshold, which I showed in with randomized trial data again. So there are very real reasons that we don't see that association there, and there was a conflict of interest.
Right. Okay. So I would say you should debate that with a scientist, because I know that there are many scientists out there who disagree with you, and I'm talking actual scientists and cardiologists out there. There are lectures about it. You could find them on YouTube. There's lots of YouTube personalities out there that could probably better fight you on this subject than I can. I'm going to kind of wave my white flag and say that you're right. I don't have any great evidence to debate you on that. I just wanted to sort of debate you on some of your claims and poke holes in your claims of causality, really. And some of your other claims as well, I don't really like, in terms of, like, feeding toddlers vegan diets and stuff like that. I really don't agree with that either. But that's for a different discussion. So
yeah. Happy to talk about that too. So yeah, like I said, you have my email if you want to do it. I'm away for a couple of weeks, but if you want to organize something later on, I'm more than happy to.
Sounds good, man. Okay, thanks again,
Okay, no problem.
Okay, have a good night.
Bye. You too.